Everybody today? Excellent. Ready for the party tonight? Yes. So my name's Ross Smith. I'm an architect within the Intune Customer Acceleration team, focusing on Outlook Mobile and how we securely deploy it for enterprise customers like yourselves. My agenda is rather simple. I hope by the end of today you'll be able to walk out of here knowing that you can deploy Outlook Mobile securely for your data, and we'll cover four key areas. The basic underpinnings of the architecture and how we secure it, how you can secure your connectivity to your tenant, how we'll protect the data on the mobile device itself, and then finally, for those that aren't familiar, we'll talk a little bit about the underpinnings of the security architecture within Office 365. Now, as organizations, you've been undergoing many transformations. Some of them have been going on for many years. We look at, transforming the digital age. We moved beyond doing paper-based communications to leveraging email. Now all of you are undergoing potentially a transformation from traditional on-premises infrastructure to the Microsoft Cloud and Office 365 and Azure Active Directory and other cloud services. And then, of course, we have a transformation of the workforce itself. Gone are the days of being locked behind a desk and working 9 to 5. We now are being more on the go. 33% of our users are using mobile devices to collaborate. And so real-time collaboration has become a must for the workforce. They want to collaborate from any location using any device with familiar apps across all of those platforms. And so we need to look at a way and how we can secure that and balance that security and productivity. We want to ensure that we can enable those productivity tools to get that real-time collaboration without compromising our data. And that's where the Enterprise Mobility and Security Suite comes into play. That solution is a holistic, comprehensive solution that is built into the very fabric of the Microsoft Cloud, grounded in the identity construct to enable scenarios like device management, app management, data protection, identity protection, threat protection, and more. All so that you can have the ability to enable access to your protected data from a trusted user using a trusted device or app. That's the principle in which EMS is founded. And we'll be going through today how that is implemented, whether your data is in the cloud or still on premises for your mailboxes. So let's look at the security basics. Today, we leverage two data synchronization protocols for Outlook Mobile. We have a proprietary device API that connects into our Outlook fabric that runs within Azure. That connection is protected via TLS 1.2 and certificate pinning. And then we use the stateless protocol translator to convert. We decrypt that session. We convert the proprietary API into an API that Exchange Online understands, and then which is the REST API. And we encrypt that with TLS 1.2 as well. So the end-to-end session is encrypted. And behind the scenes, we authenticate through OAuth, utilizing, or what we refer to as modern auth. So there's no basic credentials. There's no credential caching. Everything is within the Microsoft Cloud. But we've taken that a step further for your on-premises customers through the use of hybrid modern authentication. By setting up a hybrid relationship with the Microsoft Cloud, we can move the identity construct into Azure Active Directory, and we can provide advanced capabilities with EMS to protect that data on the mobile device. In this session, we add a third data synchronization protocol, the ActiveSync protocol. Now, the TLS connectivity protection on that is dependent on how you've configured your Exchange on-premises environment. We have steps on the Hilo blog that walk through how to set up TLS 1.2 for your 2013 and 2016 infrastructures. But the other key thing about this architecture is that it leverages OAuth. Now, some of you may think, why is the data being synchronized into Exchange Online? Why do we have that component there? And it's because the Outlook app is built from the ground to leverage the cloud. We offload processing into our Microsoft Cloud. We're leveraging the AI and intelligence capabilities that we've built in the cloud to provide unique value-add services to Outlook Mobile or Outlook for iOS and Android. And it's because of that that we enable this capability. But by leveraging the cloud in this way, it's your tenant, which means we respect your compliance and regulatory requirements for Office 365 and Exchange Online. But we're not done there. We want to evolve the architecture, and we want to do it in several ways. Today, we have way too many data synchronization protocols for accessing data across the suite of Outlook. We have MAPI HTTP for Outlook Desktop. We have Exchange Web Services for Outlook for Mac. We have the REST API and the device proprietary API for Outlook Mobile. And then we have the Windows 10 native mail client, which we refer to colloquially as Outlook Universal, which uses the HIX protocol. So we're consolidating, and we're going to be consolidating down the two protocols, HIX and MAPI HTTP. Outlook for Mac, Outlook Mobile, and the Windows 10 client will all leverage the HIX protocol. This helps us tremendously because we'll now be able to solve one core problem that all of you tell us about all the time, which is why doesn't a feature light up faster across all the platforms? By simplifying the protocol stack, we can invest faster and more quickly. So that's one benefit. The second benefit is that we recognize that having a data synchronization component that resides still within the Microsoft Cloud is an unnecessary burden. And so we're removing that so that the client connects directly to Exchange Online for data connections. This means that the compliance boundary is now located solely within Office 365 as opposed to Azure and Office 365. By removing that stateless protocol translator, it improves our synchronization capability because now we don't have a middle tier component doing that decrypt and conversion and re-encrypt. And it will enable us, as I mentioned, to gain new features and support other unique Office 365 sovereign clouds like Government Community Cloud High, Department of Defense, and Office 365 for Germany, etc. We begin, as Tali and Michael mentioned, we'll begin the migration for this architecture later this year, and it will be seamless to the end users. So when this occurs, they'll just continue using the app as they always have, and new features will light up as we release them. And if I hadn't made it clear, because this keeps coming up as a misconception, we do not leverage basic authentication for on-premises mailboxes with hybrid modern authentication or Office 365 mailboxes. It is grounded in modern authentication. It is the only way to authenticate for those scenarios, which means that we are able to take advantage of advanced authentication capabilities that we previously didn't have available, like multi-factor authentication, where we can use text-based direct calling, or our preferred method through the Microsoft Authenticator app, a means to validate the user before they receive an OAuth token for access to the service. It also enables us to do single sign-on across the umbrella of Microsoft apps. So when you authenticate in Outlook, we can re-leverage that token to obtain a second token to access the next service that they're attempting to access, like Teams, without having the user have to enter their password in a second time. And all of this is done because the Microsoft Cloud is built with OAuth in mind. It is a feature that cannot be disabled, despite what some guidance may indicate. Exchange Online is built for modern authentication. You can control a particular client and how a particular client behaves with OAuth, namely the Outlook desktop client. But the other clients will use modern authentication regardless of what the OAuth 2 client profile enabled setting is in Exchange Online. So always keep that in mind. You don't have to have Outlook desktop leveraging modern auth to get Outlook mobile leveraging modern auth, or vice versa. So I always like to go through flows, and we'll see a bunch of these today. Now, our preferred identity model is a synchronized identity model where you're using password hash synchronization or pass-through authentication with AAD Connect. But we do support federated identity, and there are some unique scenarios that require federated identity. Federated identity is the more complex scenario, and how many of you are still using federated identity today? Okay. I'm assuming the rest of you will use synchronized identity or are using synchronized identity, right? Okay. So with the federated identity model, the way this works is that the client will attempt to authenticate against Azure Active Directory. Azure Active Directory will issue an on-premises federated endpoint redirect to the on-premises identity provider. That identity provider will authenticate the user and provide a logon token. The client will then provide that logon token back to Azure Active Directory, which will then provide an access refresh token pair, scope between the client and Exchange Online. That token is then passed through our data synchronization protocol flow to the stateless protocol translator. We do our magic, and the token is then passed to Exchange Online. Exchange Online validates the token, provides access to the mailbox data, and the data is synchronized back to the client. Now, what happens if we throw in a hybrid modern authentication enabled on-premises mailbox into the mix? Well, we have to do two more steps. First, we have to obtain a second access token. Using the first access token obtained for the user, we obtain a second token on behalf of that user. This second token is scoped to between Exchange Online and the on-premises environment. That second token is then used to authenticate the user against Exchange on-premises, providing access to the user's mailbox data within the on-premises environment. Now, that one scenario that does require federated identity is certificate-based authentication, but it's very unique in that. So what effectively happens here is we're replacing the password with the certificate to authenticate the user. That certificate is passed to the on-premises identity provider. What does the on-premises identity provider do in return? It provides back a logon token. That logon token is then provided to Azure Active Directory, and Azure Active Directory generates an access refresh token pair. So behind the scenes, even certificate-based auth, we're still leveraging modern authentication and an OAuth flow. Last but not least, how many of you are interested in hybrid modern authentication for on-premises mailboxes? Okay, good number of hands. So I thought it would be good to walk through what that flow looks like. And I'm going to introduce a new service in our Outlook fabric that runs in Azure, and that's auto-detect. You can think of auto-detect as auto-discover on steroids. Auto-discover is narrowly scoped to understand Exchange mailboxes, where auto-detect is designed to understand the commercial side of things, like Exchange, but also the consumer side of things, like Gmail and Yahoo and Outlook.com. So when the first time a user launches Outlook, they're presented with a dialog to enter their email address. Upon tapping Next, that email address is passed to the auto-detect service. Auto-detect will do a lookup, determine that this mailbox most likely belongs to Exchange Online, and issue an unauthenticated auto-discover request against Exchange Online. Because of the hybrid relationship you have set up, Exchange Online knows that this mailbox resides on premises. So it will issue a 302 redirect to the on-premises auto-discover endpoint. Auto-detect will then establish a second unauthenticated request to the auto-discover endpoint on premises, passing two variables, the SMTP address and the protocol endpoint we want to learn more information about, which happens to be the ActiveSync protocol. Auto-discover will respond with the ActiveSync endpoint URL. Auto-detect at that point will establish a second unauthenticated request to on-prem, this time to the ActiveSync endpoint. And it will issue an empty authorization bearer challenge asking ActiveSync if it supports modern authentication as an authentication flow. ActiveSync will respond with a challenge response indicating that in fact does support OAuth and respond with the OAuth endpoint, which happens to be Azure Active Directory. At this point, Outlook will prompt the user with the credential flow. And this is the first time the user enters his password or a certificate if we're doing CBA. Ultimately, what will happen is that we will obtain an access refresh token pair. That will then be passed and we'll begin our data synchronization flow. Upon hitting Exchange Online, because we've auto-detect passed certain information as part of the setup that this is an on-premises mailbox, that will kick off a provisioning API within Exchange Online, the MRS service. The MRS service will do two things. It's going to obtain that second access token so that we can authenticate against Exchange Online for this particular user, and it will provision a mailbox if one doesn't already exist. We will then establish our third connection to on-premises. This time it's an authenticated connection utilizing that OAuth token to begin data synchronization. And then, of course, behind the scenes, because we're using OAuth, whenever that access token expires, we use the refresh token to obtain a new access token without prompting the user to enter their credentials. So out of this, if you remember nothing else, there's two things I want you to remember. First, Outlook Mobile never connects to the on-premises environment. It only connects to the Microsoft Cloud. So that's number one. Number two, there are only three connection events that we make. Two of them are via auto detect, and they're unauthenticated because we have to establish that we can do OAuth as the mechanism for authentication. And then the third connection is the authenticated ActiveSync connection for that particular user by Exchange Online. Some of you may be migrating from a third-party MDM to Intune to leverage this type of architecture, or some of you may not have ActiveSync exposed on the internet today, and you may not want to expose ActiveSync entirely to the internet. You can lock that down if you need to. And we do have IP reservations for both auto detect and obviously Exchange Online to manage that for you. So with that, let's talk about how we secure connectivity to your tenant within the Microsoft Cloud. The way we do that is through conditional access. Conditional access is nothing more than a policy-driven approach that basically takes a bunch that acts on an if-then approach. We take a bunch of assignments and conditions, and if those are met, we then take an action, whether we allow or block access. Those assignments are scoped to the users and the cloud services we want to apply the policy to. And then we have a set of conditions, like the device platform. Are they using iOS, Android, Mac, Windows? What IP address are they connecting from? What client app are they using? Are they using a modern authentication-capable client? Are they using a web browser? Are they using ActiveSync? Or are they using a basic authentication client like POP or IMAP? And then based on that, we can define an action. Are we going to block access outright, or are we going to allow access? And if we allow access, we can do things like require multi-factor authentication, or we can require device enrollment, or we could require that they use a particular app. Now, what do these grant controls actually do? Well, for the required devices to be marked as compliant, that grant control first off requires that for mobile devices that the device be enrolled in Intune. And second, it validates that the device compliance policies you've configured as part of the enrollment are actually enforced on the device. If both those conditions are true, then that device is allowed to connect as part of that authentication request. If they aren't true, then the device is blocked. And then, of course, we have require multi-factor authentication, which is a way we can provide advanced security as part of the authentication. This requires Azure MFA as part of your deployment and requires at least one authentication method. We recommend that you require that. If you only require one, it's the Microsoft Authenticator app. But most likely you'll want a secondary mechanism in case that app has been wiped for whatever reason or reset due to new device enrollment. And then the one that we're going to focus on for the majority of this talk is the require approved client app grant control. This is a grant control that is based on and include a static whitelist within Azure Active Directory that includes all first-party apps, so all Microsoft mobile apps that have integrated the Intune SDK, meaning that they support app protection policies from Intune. So there is an assumption that an Intune license is required, which is why the previous slide indicated that you need at least an EMS E3 subscription to tackle and leverage conditional access. Now, we recognize that the require approved client app grant control is limited today. And so over the next coming months, you'll be hearing about how we're improving this area. We're going to be adding support for third-party and line of business apps. We're going to move this away from being a statically defined whitelist that we have to deploy new code to update to being a dynamic whitelist. And we're going to look at how we can enhance the controls and make them more granular going forward. So look for that information in the future. But for now, let's talk about this require approved client app and how we can leverage that to enforce Outlook Mobile as the only mobile messaging client. So we'll have a set of assignments, like in this case we have Jane, and we have our cloud apps defined. Now at a minimum, to use Outlook Mobile, we need Office 365 Exchange Online as our cloud app. But if we think back to that paradigm shift, real-time collaboration, on any device from anywhere, we need more than just Outlook Mobile. We need to support Teams, Skype for Business, OneDrive for Business, SharePoint, Yammer, all of it. So while we say at a minimum, you might need to include all those other cloud apps as part of the offering to enable the true real-time collaboration scenario. From a condition perspective, we're going to narrowly scope this policy to apply to iOS and Android devices, and we're going to focus it on modern authentication-capable clients. So if Jane, and then for our action, we'll define an allow action with the require approved client app. So if Jane is using Outlook Mobile when she authenticates, she will be allowed access. But if Jane decides to try and use iOS 11 Mail or iOS 12 Mail, which is a modern authentication-capable client, Jane will be blocked access. And she'll be guided to install an approved client app by Azure Active Directory. And that's a key thing you'll see throughout the rest of this presentation, is we've done a lot of work to guide the user to the correct path, because we want to ensure they do it the right way without impeding what they're attempting to do. So what do we require to enable this flow? Well, we have an Outlook client that's attempting to authenticate against Azure Active Directory. When we attempt to authenticate against Azure Active Directory, conditional access policies are evaluated. We see that the require approved client app grant control is required for this flow. Azure Active Directory will then determine if this authentication flow was issued through a broker app. If a broker app did not issue this request, Azure Active Directory will notify the user that they have to install a broker app. This broker app on iOS is the Microsoft Authenticator app. On Android, it is the company portal app from Intune. Once that app is installed, the broker app will facilitate the Azure Active Directory authentication through the ADAL library integration. It will do two things. The first thing is it's going to register the device in Azure Active Directory. Think of this as a workplace join of the device so that we can apply policies to this particular device for this particular user. The second thing it does is it validates that the app ID that the user is attempting to use to authenticate against this particular cloud service is on the known list of approved app IDs. If the app is on the approved list, an access refresh token pair is generated, and the user gains access to the service. But we're not done there. So we've allowed Outlook Mobile, and we've blocked modern authentication clients. Unfortunately, modern authentication ActiveSync clients are in the small percentage of available ActiveSync clients. The vast majority of ActiveSync clients are basic authentication-capable ActiveSync clients, and we need to stop them too. Thankfully, we can do that with a second conditional access policy. So we'll target our users. We'll assign this policy against the Office 365 Exchange Online Cloud app because it's the only cloud service that uses Exchange ActiveSync, and we'll set one condition. The cloud app condition will be, or the client app condition will be set to Exchange ActiveSync. Now, this is where it may sound counterintuitive. We're not going to block access with this conditional access policy. Instead, we're going to define the action to be an allow, but we're going to set the granular control to be require approved client app. What happens in this type of configuration is when Jane attempts to set up a basic auth ActiveSync client, that device is going to get quarantined by Exchange Online. And Exchange Online will deliver a quarantine email that specifically tells Jane that she has to use Outlook. If we set any other controls, whether it be require MFA or require device compliance, or if we even outright set the action as block access, Exchange Online would have delivered different quarantine emails in all of those conditions and wouldn't have guided Jane to install Outlook. So this is the way that we can get Jane to use the correct mobile app. From a flow perspective, and again, looking at the more complicated federated identity scenario, this is the flow. Jane sets up her ActiveSync profile and authenticates with basic authentication. Exchange Online will pass that authentication request to the on-premises identity provider. And the on-premises identity provider will authenticate Jane and issue a SAML token. That SAML token will be provided back to Exchange Online, which then provides it to Azure Active Directory. Azure Active Directory will then evaluate this authentication request, see this conditional access policy in play, and return to Exchange Online a particular device query response device not known with managed app. This tells Exchange Online to quarantine the device, allow the device profile setup to complete, and issue that quarantine email that states, Jane, install Outlook Mobile if you want to access your mobile mail. But we're not done there. Think about this. As you may have heard earlier this week, we collect trillions of data sources today, and we feed them into an intelligent security graph. Those data sources include Exchange Online Advanced Threat Protection, Windows Advanced Threat Protection, which includes Windows Defender Services. We look at all of our authentication requests. We scrape the web. We work with law enforcement agencies. And we've built this graph so that we can feed it into services like Azure Active Directory, so that when a user authenticates, we can look at that data and make a proactive decision on the risk that user may have to the environment, so that we can take action and do things like allow access, block access, require MFA, or even a more advanced scenario of resetting the user's password so that they have to do something to gain access. So we can take advantage of this. To do so, we have to enable it. Within Azure Active Directory portal, you have to enable the Advanced Azure Identity Protection module, and then we'll create a risk policy. Our recommended practice for this is you create a risk policy scope for high-risk users, and you force those high-risk users to reset their password. That also does require you to set up self-service password reset as part of this flow. But once you set up this risk policy, we can now use sign-in risk as an additional condition in our conditional access policies. That additional condition, when used, evaluates those type of events. Events like, has this password been leaked on the web? Am I doing something odd, like attempting to authenticate multiple times unsuccessfully? Am I attempting to authenticate here in Orlando and then 2 hours later attempting to authenticate in Seattle? That's an atypical travel scenario. We don't have my Star Trek transporters yet, so there's no way I can do that. Am I using an anonymous IP? Am I using an IP that has been a known malware provider, et cetera? All these conditions can now be evaluated when the user authenticates to make a decision on that user's risk. And if that user is deemed risky, we can take action on it. So we move away from this reactive model of dealing with compromised accounts to a proactive model, which completely changes our scope in terms of how we protect the environment. So let's look at a few examples of how this works. So we have an executive marketing user, right? So a privileged type of user who last successfully authenticated in London, but now is attempting to authenticate in Paris. That's not potentially an atypical travel location, depending on the time frame. But what is interesting about this user is that they have failed to authenticate multiple times while in Paris. And so that immediately, the intelligent graph immediately elevates that sign-in risk to a medium threat level. And if we had created a conditional access policy that says, for users with medium risk, we will require MFA in addition to the approved apps, we can, A, stop that potential attacker right in their tracks, as they won't be able to issue or authenticate via that secondary authentication mechanism. We alert the user that something's up, and we've alerted IT that something's happened through the monitoring and auditing reports that are available through the identity protection capability. So that's just one example. How about another? So we have a sales account rep. Again, successfully authenticated a few hours ago in London. Now they're attempting to authenticate again, but this time we can't detect their IP address. So that in of itself is risky. So that sets a medium risk for this particular user. But we've also detected that that user's credentials have been leaked to the dark web. That immediately elevates that risk to high risk. Because of the risk policy we defined for our users to say high-risk users must reset their password, we'll then start them down a flow. We guide them. We tell them that their account has been compromised and that they have to reset their password. And through the self-service password reset, which can leverage multi-factor authentication as a verification means to reset their password, we can be sure that their password is reset by that particular user. Now, You could have done this different ways too. You could block access, in which case that would force the user to have to contact help desk to initiate that password recovery flow. So there are options here. You don't have to do it through a password reset if you don't want to, but that capability does exist. So now, hopefully, you understand how we can ensure that only low risk to no risk users get authenticated to the Microsoft Cloud. Now we need to look at, once they do get access, how do we ensure the data is protected? So for years, we've had traditional device management capabilities. How many of you are using device management enrollment today? Okay, so that's the majority of you. Yes, so device management, for those that aren't using it, is a means by which we can fully manage the device. We can push down compliance policies like the PIN requirements and encryption. We can do configuration policies where you push down certificates, VPN configuration, proxy settings, etc. You can push down apps. You can manage the entire device experience effectively. And of course, you can do wipes, which wipe the entire device and erase all the data. And as we have moved into this more modern transformation of real-time collaboration, we all know mobile devices are now ubiquitous. Users have devices. And so a fourth type of transformation is moving beyond providing corporate-owned devices to leveraging and reusing the user's own investment, their personal device, for both personal and work data. And we know, and I'm sure all of you, even though we're all in IT, know that we don't really want to enroll our own personal device into IT, because we always fear that one mistake might happen and that IT admin may accidentally wipe our device and thus we lose our favorite child pictures, etc., depending on the device configuration. And so each platform offers different capabilities in this space. With iOS, it's a fully managed device experience. With Android, they've seen that this blending of work and personal is something of a priority. And so with Android 5.0, they introduced Android for Work, which they've rebranded as Android Enterprise. Android Enterprise offers an interesting experience for this BYOD type of deployment model, where upon enrolling the device, Android creates a work instance within that device. It's effectively a container for which all corporate data can be placed and all corporate apps can run out of, thus providing a separation between the personal existence and the work existence. And that gives that personal assurance that personal data won't be wiped while corporate data can be wiped. And it also gives that management and containerization type of approach that IT is looking for. And as you can see in this screenshot, you'll see two instances of Outlook. One Outlook that has the briefcase icon, meaning that's the work profile instance of Outlook. And then there is the other instance of Outlook, which is the personal profile instance of Outlook. But how do we leverage Android Enterprise such that we can control and ensure only corporate data is put into the work profile? Well, we can do that with 5 easy steps with Intune. First, we have to set up our device enrollment process. So we'll link our Intune account with Android for Enterprise. The second thing is we'll specify our Android Enterprise enrollment settings. This is where we will disable the legacy device admin experience, which Android is deprecating in future releases, and enabling Android Enterprise work profile enrollment scenarios. The third thing we'll do is we will approve all the corporate apps we want available within the work profile. This is like Outlook and the rest of the Office apps, the company portal, and any other third-party or potentially line of business apps that you need to leverage. And then the next thing we'll do is we will then assign all of these apps to our users that will be leveraging Android Enterprise devices. And then we will mark some of these, if not all, depending on your configuration, which apps we will require, thus when you enroll the device, they are automatically installed, versus which apps are available for the user to install themselves. And then the last but not least, the most important thing, is we have to create a conditional access policy. This is where we can protect and ensure that only the data is accessible within the work profile and cannot be added to the personal profile instances of the apps. And we'll use a grant control here, require device to be marked as compliant. So by setting that particular grant control, whenever the user attempts to add a corporate account, say to Outlook, in the personal profile, they'll be prompted to enroll the device. But when device enrollment occurs, it creates a work profile. The user will never successfully be able to enroll in the personal instance of Outlook because the data must be contained within a work profile. So this is how we ensure that the data is contained within the work profile in Android Enterprise. But we're not done there. As I mentioned, users want to use their personal devices, and they want to do it without enrollment. So this is where Intune adds a unique value proposition that isn't available in other MDM solutions or EMM solutions. And this is what we refer to as app protection policies. This is where we can deploy a policy to the app that protects the corporate data within that app without requiring you to enroll the device. So let's look at what that is. And we do this along key 4 pillars. First and foremost, our Office apps are built with the multiple identity construct in mind. We've built all of them to be able to be used, whether it's for consumers as well as commercial accounts, like Outlook, where you can have a work account, work email, and personal email built into the app so you can manage your entire life or day from a messaging and calendaring perspective. So our app policies are designed with the multiple identity construct in mind, and we can apply and target protections to the corporate identity. Because remember, everything we've done from an EMS perspective is grounded in the construct of the identity. That is where everything occurs. So we can protect only the corporate data and leave the personal data alone. And through our data protection capabilities, we implement encryption capability. So we can target that corporate data and we can encrypt it. And not only can we encrypt it, we can wipe that corporate data if needed. And we do it along 3 key capabilities. So we can issue admin level wipes. So the Intune admin can trigger a wipe of just that corporate data within the apps. We can issue the user can initiate a wipe by failing to meet policy requirements that you've defined within this app protection policy. And then third, and probably one of the more coolest of the wipe scenarios, is we can trigger an offline interval wipe, where if the app hasn't connected back to the Intune service after a period of time, the app, upon the next time the app is launched, it will automatically wipe access to the data. And then, of course, this kind of begs the question, well, if we're not enrolling the device, then how do we ensure certain compliance policies are in effect? I've talked about encryption. We'll go into that one in detail. But how do we do data access? How do we prevent, if I can't force a PIN on the device, how do I ensure that the data isn't accessible by anyone who picks up the device? And that's through our data access protection mechanisms. We can leverage the identity and enforce protection to access that data, whether that be via PIN, biometric, or your account credentials themselves, so that when you launch the app, you must enter a PIN in order to gain access to the corporate data. We also validate device health. Even though the device isn't enrolled, we can determine through the Intune SDK whether the device has been jailbroken or rooted, and we can issue a wipe if need be, or block access. And then, of course, we also look at environment variables, and we've done a huge amount of work this last calendar year in the environment variable space. We've added support for minimum operating system, app version, the SDK version. We've looked at and we've built in the capability for you to scope the device model to an iPad or iPhone, or the device manufacturer in the Android space so that you can only allow Samsung devices if need be, or whatever. And we've also even implemented the ability for you to target minimum patch versions of Android so that you can be assured that your devices are only accessed on operating system or versions that you've approved. And that leads us into our data transfer capabilities. Once you gain access to the data, how do we ensure that the data is not leaked, especially to unprotected or personal type of accounts? And we do that through many different mechanisms. We can protect within the app and ensure that data can't be transferred between the work account and the personal account. We can do it as well when you try and transfer data between the apps through like Apple's open file share mechanisms, we can prevent the data flow to an unprotected app. We can do it with cut, copy, and paste as well. We can enforce that you have to use a particular browser, either the Edge browser or the Intune Managed browser for corporate accounts. We can prevent third-party keyboards if need be. So we have all of these advanced level controls to ensure the data is protected and secured in the scenario whether you decide to enroll the device or if you decide not to enroll the device. From a data access control perspective, I wanted to talk about two key things that we've implemented. So we have two timeouts, or two checks to validate. We have a usage timeout check. So after a period of time that you define as the admin, when the user next time launches one of the apps, we will prompt them for a PIN. And they have to enter their PIN or biometric or credentials to gain access to that corporate data again. We also do app transition checks. So anytime the app's launched or resumed, we execute these checks to see if any of those variables that I mentioned, device environment variables, health variables, etc., have changed so that we can immediately take action on those. The cool thing about the usage timeout check is that we will share that timeout check across the apps that are protected with the Intune SDK through the app protection policy, so that when you unlock the corporate data within Outlook, you don't have to go and enter the PIN before you can transfer data to the corporate account within your OneNote app. And as I mentioned, we also have the ability on many of these access control checks to define what the action is that you initiate. Do you warn the user that they're doing something they shouldn't be, like they're using an outdated operating system and they have to update, like I have in the screenshot? We can block access until they fix that particular thing. Like if we didn't want them to access a particular Android patch version until they upgraded. Or we could wipe in the event that they do something like they jailbreak or root their iOS or Android device. From an encryption perspective, many of you may be thinking, so if I don't enroll the device, how do I ensure that encryption's enabled on said device? And the answer is, we don't care if the encryption's been enabled on the device, because we will encrypt the contents of the corporate data independently of the device encryption status. Now, with iOS, device encryption is pretty much guaranteed these days, because in order to enable Touch ID or Face ID, you must have a PIN, and the APIs thus invoke encryption on that particular device. The user has to go through a lot of steps and disable a lot of cool features in order not to have encryption on an iOS device these days. Android's a little different. Android, the user has some more flexibility there in terms of what they do. But either way, we do all of our encryption independently of the underlying device status. Now, how we do that device encryption varies depending on whether the device is encrypted, whether the device is iOS or Android. On iOS, we leverage the native encryption APIs built into the operating system, and we take advantage of them to enhance or encrypt the content of the data. For example, we leverage within the Intune SDK, we leverage the iOS common crypto methods to invoke encryption and decryption capabilities. We leverage a 256-bit encryption key per user per device to do this. And we do it, and we execute this type of encryption with use of data buffers and whenever we write data to disk for the particular app. So we can encrypt the content of the corporate data within our Outlook database file, as an example, using our common crypto methods invoked through the Intune SDK. And then for certain operating system functions, we leverage the operating system to invoke the encryption during access transfer mechanisms, as an example. So when I want to transfer the data between apps through the file share extension, we'll invoke the OS APIs to ensure that that data is encrypted, so that if the data does happen to be shared to an unprotected app, it's entirely encrypted and inaccessible. And then from an Android perspective, we execute this encryption during file read-write operations. Now, the difference in Android and iOS is that we don't leverage the native encryption capabilities within the Android platform, because the Android platform is very diverse. And so we built our own encryption stack leveraging OpenSSL. Now, today that leverages a 128-bit encryption key, again, per user, per device, again, stored within the Intune service. We are upgrading that to a 256-bit encryption key, hopefully by the end of the year. And the other key change in Android compared to iOS is the iOS encryption APIs are FIPS 140-2 certified. Our Android OpenSSL method today is not FIPS 140-2 certified. We recognize that's important, and we hope to have that certification done by the end of this calendar year as well. So, again, I like doing these flows only because it shows how we guide the user in the process. So we have Jamie here who launches Outlook and wants to add her corporate account. Once she adds her corporate account, an Intune app protection policy is immediately applied. Because, why? She authenticates against Azure Active Directory, and the Intune service are integrated. It tells the Intune SDK, detects that a policy has been applied to that particular identity for that particular app, and the policy is pushed down to the mobile device for that particular app. The Intune SDK then acts. It invokes that she has to create a PIN, so we invoke the data access capability. She sets up her PIN, and once that's complete, she's then able to launch Outlook and access her corporate mail. That app protection policy also did things like block, copy, paste, and encrypt the underlying data. Now, Jamie likes to use the native Notes app on her mobile device to transfer data that she wants to remember for future activities. She attempts to use this flow today, and she's immediately guided or blocked by that action. She's guided to use something that actually works with her corporate account, that triggers a memory in her head that, oh yeah, she should use OneNote. She then launches OneNote through the power of SSO. We are able to authenticate her without asking for her credentials again. App protection policies applied to that app, and then she is able to paste that content in the OneNote into the corporate repository stored in SharePoint. And thus, she's able to continue about her day. So that's the flow. Now, last but not least, we've heard lots and lots of feedback from you around how can we manage Outlook for iOS and Android and control it from an IT and enterprise perspective. So we've been investing in that for this last year. And so that's through what we refer to as app configuration policies. We have several supported scenarios today, and we have some new scenarios coming in the future. So scenario number 1, account setup configuration. This is where for enrolled devices, we push down the basic underpinnings of the account configuration information so that when the user launches the app, they only have to enter in their password to authenticate. They don't have to know their SMTP address. They don't need to know their UPN to authenticate. They are able to quickly load their account and get on with their day. This will work with any MDM because we deliver this through the MDM OS channels that both iOS and Android support. So that's a huge thing, I'd hope. Wow, okay. So that's account setup config. We launched Basic Auth many months ago. We now, this week, we have launched modern authentication support for both Office 365 and hybrid modern authentication accounts for on-premises mailboxes with that scenario. The second area that we have added support for that we launched this week is what we refer to as organization allowed accounts mode. This is a very specifically designed scenario. We had a very subset of financial customers. How many people are financial customers? Okay, so we had a subset of the financial community come back to us and say, hey, we have this highly regulated set of users where we have deployed corporate-owned devices that are completely locked down. We control every aspect of that device, what apps are loaded, what apps are accessed. We record the audio conversations that user has on those devices. We want to use Outlook Mobile, but Outlook Mobile offers a problem for us in that Outlook Mobile supports multiple identities. We don't want this highly regulated user to add their personal account to that device because that affects our compliance capabilities on that device in terms of how we manage and report on this regulated user. What can you do to solve that? So organizational allowed accounts mode is an enrolled device scenario, again delivered through the MDM OS channel available in Android and iOS that targets the app and prevents the user from adding anything other than their corporate account and the associated OneDrive for Business account of that device, of that user. The third area that we support is what I refer to as data protection scenarios. Data protection scenarios require Intune. So this is delivered through the Intune App Protection Policy framework within the Intune SDK, and these are targeted scenarios. Disabling wearables is an example that we have delivered through app configuration policies. The ability, what I've shown on the screen is protecting contact field export. So Tali mentioned this yesterday during the demo, where we have a user, or we have an environment where customers like to put all sorts of their users, I should say, not customers, but users like to put all sorts of interesting information in the notes field. As an example, I've done this myself. I have put a social security number in the notes field of a contact for my child, so I can easily find that information. That information, while in my Office 365 mailbox, I know it's protected, but the problem is, in order to use caller ID and FaceTime and text messaging and everything else, we have to take the Office 365 contacts that are within the Outlook app, and we have to export them to the native Contacts app. Once we export that Contacts app is unprotected. We don't have app protection policies against that Contacts app. So we can't ensure that that data can't be leaked at that point. And so to control that and give flexibility to you as IT to ensure what data can and cannot be put into the unprotected space, we build an app configuration policy capability to allow you to define which fields of a contact will be exported. You could be like one of our customers where they've locked it down to only first name, last name, and phone number are exported. Or you could allow all fields like another customer that just allowed every field but the notes field. So you have that flexibility and control there. And then the URL at the bottom is our website that indicates what all these configuration keys are that are available for deploying it. But we're not done there. So we're introducing a new capability within the Intune portal through app configuration policies, where we'll provide a nice user interface to enable settings. And the one that everybody has been asking for is the ability to turn on contact sync. So beyond just being able to set up account setup configuration, we will provide the ability to manage configuration settings of the app itself. We've targeted a very small list for the initial release, but as time goes on, we will continue to grow the settings that we will support in app configuration. Now, at launch of this, which will occur in the next month, hopefully, if everything goes well, this will be supported for enrolled devices. So these settings will be delivered through the MDM OS channel, which means any MDM can manage these particular settings. We will also deliver these settings through the Intune SDK App Protection Policy Framework so that you can do this for devices that are not enrolled as well. And that will come at a later date. Cool. I'm so happy. So the last area that I kind of want to touch on is how is the data secured in Office 365? How many of you are still on-premises mailboxes? So I always think it's good to kind of target this, because if you're already in Office 365 and Exchange Online, you probably know many of these. But if you're still on premises, you may not recognize what we've done in the securing space of Office 365, and thus you may have concerns around the whole hybrid modern authentication approach that we've outlined. So I thought I would kind of cover what this is. So first and foremost, there is zero standing administrative access within Office 365. No one has access to customer data. We have to go through a just-in-time process to gain access to any customer data. The process that we leverage is a tool known as Lockbox. Lockbox provides us the ability to ensure that those requests are time-scoped and scope limited in terms of what engineer can access and what data can be accessed. And the way this kind of works is that you as the customer initiate an issue with us. Like, let's say on a mailbox there are some corrupted calendar items. That Microsoft engineer will then submit a request to Lockbox. for the access to that particular user's mailbox, to access that particular calendar data, to evaluate what's going on. That will kick off a flow that triggers an approval process where humans must approve access to that data. Once that's approved, the data is accessed. But we've extended this capability beyond just generic Microsoft human intervention to gain access, where we can now invoke you as the customer have to have final say in whether the data is accessed. And in this way, you end up controlling authorization of personnel access to your data. So that's Lockbox. The other thing that we do, and we take very seriously, is to ensure the data is secured by default. Now, I've already mentioned through the Outlook mobile flows that we ensure client-to-server communication is protected with TLS 1.2. We also ensure server-to-server communication is protected with TLS 1.2, like the stateless protocol translator to Exchange Online. We also ensure all data center to data center communications are protected with TLS 1.2. We also, at rest, do a number of things. We leverage BitLocker to ensure the disks are protected at rest. And as Jacqueline Hernaka announced last year at Ignite, we introduced service encryption for Exchange Online. Service encryption is where we can encrypt the actual mailbox content data with an encryption key, thereby providing separation of duty between the admins and the service. Now, we've extended that support as well, so that there is now service encryption with customer key, so that you, as the customer, define the key that's used and own the key that's used to do that service encryption, so that you can manage it, you can audit it, and in the end, if need be, you can revoke access. So that's service encryption with customer key. And those technologies are all available whether the mailbox is hosted in Office 365 or we're synchronizing a portion of your on-premises mailbox data into Office 365 for the hybrid modern authentication flow. That was one small clap I heard. Last but not least, one other scenario that enterprise mobility and security includes is data protection. That's known as what was referred to as Azure Information Protection, which we now refer to as Microsoft Information Protection. And this is an area we're keenly invested in with Outlook Mobile as well. For those that aren't familiar, information protection is a means by which you can discover all the data within your environment, classify that data through sensitive labels. That sensitive label defines a policy-based action. That policy-based action could be a governance action where we define the longevity that the data resides within the environment. Or I should say, it could be a protection-based policy where we add watermarks and headers to the data. We apply rights management encryption to the data and ensure who and what can be done with that particular set of data. And then, of course, we build in the tools so that you can monitor and audit what is done with that data throughout its life cycle. How we're investing this in Outlook Mobile is we're adding the ability to define the sensitive label on the emails during composition. Not only during composition, but you can see what messages have been labeled when you're reading those email messages. In terms of the policy-based actions, those policy-based actions that the label define are triggered during the transport flow. So if that policy-based action says the message must be encrypted, when the message is transmitted to Exchange, Exchange will act on that label requirement and encrypt the message so that all intended recipients receive a rights-managed protected version of that particular message. We expect this to release in the second quarter of calendar year 19, and we'll continue enhancing this as time goes on. So before we get to summary, let's do some demos. All right. So that's 8. So I thought I would show what a conditional access policy is so that the slide I did was not made up by any means. So I have here a policy on require approved mobile client apps. We can see that in terms of users, I've targeted a set of users in my environment. We could do all users if need be. And ideally, you would target all users. to ensure that or target the subset of users that you're granting mobile access to, and ensuring that the other subset of users that you're not are blocked access. But we need to target our users. As I mentioned in the policy, we want to ensure that we are scoping this policy to ensure that we can enable real-time collaboration for our users. That would include Exchange Online, Teams, Skype for Business, SharePoint, etc. From a condition perspective, you can see that here's all the conditions we can define. I've defined our client apps as modern authentication capable clients. And I've defined our platforms as iOS and Android. And then from an access control perspective, I've defined the require approved client app. And then from we have a similar policy for block basic auth, which defines our condition as we are blocking Exchange ActiveSync. And then I was playing with this one, so I said grant block access instead of approved. So we'll switch that back. And then here's an example of a sign-in risk condition where I specified that all our users against these cloud apps have a condition where we have defined our sign-in risk to be medium or high. And if they are medium or high, then they must require MFA. So that's just a simple example of what those policies look like. And then we'll grant access and require the multi-factor authentication. And then from there, let's go to 6. So, there we go. So here I have Outlook. And just for show I didn't do anything, I've just launched Outlook. This is what our account setup configuration experience looks like in Outlook. So when I immediately launch Outlook, I'm presented with the account configuration of the particular user as defined in our policy, which I'll show in a few minutes what that policy looked like. So you can see here it says Daniel at rs4home.com, and it's managed. It's either a managed Office 365 or an Exchange hybrid account. We'll tap Add Account. And it will immediately prompt me to authenticate. So I'll launch the Authenticator app, because remember, the require approved client app condition requires that we use a broker, which happens to be Authenticator. We can see here, I do advanced lab scenarios, so you can see here that my UPN does not match my SMTP address. So I've entirely, how many of you guys do that, where your UPN doesn't match your SMTP? Yeah, see, you shouldn't do that. So we'll use my super complicated password. And we'll authenticate. And we'll see that we're authenticating. Oh, boy. And so we see that MFA has come into place, and I did not expect MFA today. Well, it did not send the code. Oh. 1 second. Our Wi-Fi is not cooperating. Anyone else have that problem this week? Come on. I don't remember if I have another way. Nope, I only did this. I only did text message. Let's try it again. And this is why you should use the Authenticator app. However, it's hard to demo the Authenticator app, because if you add the Authenticator app and you add your account credentials to the Authenticator app, then you wouldn't need to authenticate again. So I needed to remove the account in order to show the account flow. Ah, there we go. Got the PIN. So 569913. So now we'll register the device. because again, we have to do that for a workplace join. And here we go. It's adding the account now as we speak. And then we'll say maybe later. And now I'm prompted. The app protection policy has been applied, so I'm prompted to protect my data. The app will cycle. I will restart the app. Now I'm prompted. If this had been the first time I'd set up this account on this device, I would have been prompted to set up a PIN. But in this case, I have already had a PIN. And so I will enter, and now I have access to my content. So that's the magic of account setup config and MFA. Now let's go back. And how did I do all that? So I've already showed the conditional access policy, which required MFA. How did I do account setup config? So this is the app configuration policy as it stands today. As I said, we are introducing next month a user experience so that you don't have to enter these configuration keys. But behind the scenes, that UI is configuring these configuration keys. And these are the configuration keys you would use if you're using a third-party MDM. So we have an email address configuration key, we have an email UPN, and we have an account type. Now, an Intune provides us the capability to use tokens so that we don't have to target each individual's user's SMTP or UPN address. We consume that automatically as the user authenticates and use them based on the identity that they're authenticating with. So that is the configuration of how we deployed that. The app protection policy, which we saw get applied to the device, defines things like the ability of how I can transfer the data. Let's just zoom in there. Can I transfer data to other apps? Can I prevent a cloud backup? Am I going to filter the open share dialog to policy managed apps? How am I going to allow the app to receive data? I can actually control it such that I don't want to allow any unprotected app to be able to paste or share data to my protected app if need be. Why you'd want to do that, I don't know. I would think you'd want to allow some data to come into the app, like transferring data from a web page, for example, but you could do that. And then we also have controls around where you save the data. So I can prevent Outlook from being able to take an attachment and save that data anywhere but OneDrive for Business in SharePoint. I can prevent local storage. I can prevent the data from being stored in an unprotected storage repository like Box. Now, the way that will end up working is the user will only be exposed those type of share options. If they were to manage to somehow use the open share dialog to transfer the data to an unprotected app, the app protection encryption capabilities will kick in and will actually encrypt the content so that if it does get exposed to an unprotected app, it's inaccessible by that unprotected app whatsoever. And then we have other settings and the require PIN. So as you saw in my demo, I had a PIN length of 4 that I had to enter, and we can control whether I allowed fingerprint or Touch ID in this particular policy. And then the last thing that I thought I would show, let's go back in this. So if we go to my contacts, we'll see I have Lexi's account. Oh, that's the wrong one. Let's just go here. There we go. So we'll have Lexi's account, and you can see here that within Lexi's account, I put her social security number in the notes field. She has a really cool social security number too. But if I go to my contacts, because I've synchronized them, if I click on Lexi, you'll notice that in the notes field, there is no social security number, because I've blocked that ability for the notes field to be synchronized to the native app. And that is done through this app configuration policy. And this, again, is a data protection app configuration policy, which is only available for apps that have been protected through Intune App Protection in the Intune SDK. Oh, Oh, cool music. It's all right. So that is the configuration key that we deployed, com.microsoft.outlook.contactsync.notesallowed, and the value is set to false, which means that the data can't synchronize. And as I mentioned, we support a vast majority of other fields. Now, the one cool thing that some people may have noticed is that I did that entire demo with an on-premises mailbox. So, which one's this? 5. With that, we'll go back to the deck. So, hopefully, you now understand how we secure and protect corporate data with Outlook Mobile and how we enable that vision of real-time collaboration on any device from anywhere. We showed the end-to-end how we secure that connectivity stream utilizing TLS 1.2, Azure Active Directory conditional access, how we block basic and modern auth capable ActiveSync clients, and we use app protection policies to protect the data. And that we continue to evolve and enhance our capabilities through the use of information protection. If you want to know more about identity and device access policies, we have a set of information on the Microsoft 365 portal that document the entire recommended guidance for how to set these up. We break it down in terms of protection levels, so if you have sets of users that have different requirements, baseline, sensitive, highly regulated users, we have the policy and guidance crafted for you that work for both email and SharePoint. And then we'll be adding support for Teams and other workloads in the future. And of course, since you guys all stayed, you can now quickly try and obtain a free Office 365 Pro IT book. Use my preferred architecture link. Why preferred architecture? Because I used to be the Exchange guy, and I wrote the preferred architecture for Exchange 2013 and 2016. Yay. And with that, hopefully you enjoyed today's session. We have a session this afternoon at 3 o'clock on 2. Too many people are giving me different times. We have a panel session on Outlook for web, for Mac, desktop, and mobile. Come to that, ask us some advanced questions, and we'll see how that goes, who we can stump. And I'll take questions now. Sorry. Yes, I have time. I don't know if the thing's on. Okay.
When you're allowing apps such as Outlook, are you going to say only Outlook? Is it only Microsoft apps, or could you say allow Email Plus or something like that?
Today, it is only apps that support the Intune SDK and that are integrated with, that are Microsoft-based apps. Now, if an app in the future, if an app were, a third-party app were to integrate the Intune SDK, then you could support that particular scenario. But obviously, we want you to use Outlook. We think it provides the best-in-class service. Take it. Yeah. Hi.
So I was, Sean Ivey.
Yeah.
Okay. So in our